Good evening, everyone. Welcome to another episode of Confabulating. It is our great pleasure to be joined this evening by Dr. Eleanor Janega of the London School of Economics, who will be delivering a talk entitled A Brief Guide to Medieval Sex. Eleanor is a guest lecturer at the Department of International History at LSE and host of the podcast Gone Medieval. She also co-hosts the podcast We're Not So Different with Luke Waters and is a regular host on HistoryHit TV, presenting the series Medieval Pleasures and also covering a broad variety of topics related to medieval social and religious history. She holds a PhD in history and an MA in medieval studies from UCL and a BA in history from Loyola University, Chicago. Her most recent book is The Once and Future of Sex, published in 2023, which examines medieval thinking on women's beauty, sexuality, and behavior, as well as the real lives of medieval women, their work, and how they paved the way for new ideas about women's nature, intellect, and ability. Her other books and articles cover subjects such as pre-modern superstitions, sexuality and behavior, the image of death in late medieval Bohemian painting, suspect women in 14th century Prague, poverty in medieval Europe, and medieval heresy and criminal procedure. She's also published a number of pieces for publications such as the Times Literary Supplement, the Medieval Magazine, the Washington Post, and the BBC History Magazine, and has appeared in many other podcasts and shows for broadcasters such as NPR, BBC Radio 4, Vice, and CNN. Her current research focuses on the conceptualization of sex and its influence on society in the medieval and early modern period, and she specializes in sexuality, propaganda, apocalypticism, urbanity, and empire in the late medieval and early modern periods, with a particular emphasis on Bohemia and the Holy Roman Empire. Eleanor, it's fantastic to have you with us this evening. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you so much for having me, Peter. That makes me feel very fancy indeed.
Wonderful.
I'm really excited to do this, but also I'm realizing I have a kind of a real momentous task in front of me to try to conceptualize 1,000 some years of thinking about medieval sex. But we're going to give it a go anyway. So I've started us off just with the great picture of how Merlin was conceived, just to kind of get everyone in the mood for it. And I think this is a really lovely way of starting out, because I think that what it does, as I have an ambulance go by, is get people ready to kind of understand how medieval people are not as a state as many would think that they were. You know, if there's a story about how Merlin is a result of a demon shagging a queen, they're ready to show that. You know, they're not going to shy away from it. I also think it's just a great picture because look at those paintings. Absolutely gorgeous interior space. So, that I think this is the sort of thing that I wish people to keep in mind, is because when we talk about medieval sex, it can be really confusing because of who we have sources for. So first of all, we have to say, okay, so what's the medieval period, right? Incredibly boring question. That is very difficult to answer. I suppose that it starts off in 476. This is traditional. This is the quote unquote fall of Rome, which I do not believe in. Like any good medievalist, there's no such thing. But at a point in time, the last Western Roman emperor was indeed deposed. You have a number of Frankish kingdoms. So, hey, that's as good a point as any to say, I guess things are looking medieval around here. What are we calling the end of the medieval period? 1517, maybe? Martin Luther, depends on who you ask. As a Bohemian specialist, I tend to kind of date things to the Hussites, because by the time you have, not Catholics around the joint, I think we're kind of done. But then also there are people who, for example, work on medieval Iberia who might say it's 1492. But anyway, my point is, by the time you see Protestants, you have gone too far, right? And so one way or another, that is a really good and overarching way to look at the medieval period in Europe if what we are talking about is sexuality. Because when we talk about sex and sexuality, the sources that we have that are really ready to talk about these are overwhelmingly religious. So if we accept that one of the defining periods, the defining characteristics about the medieval period is that the church is there, and then it's pumping out rather a lot of philosophers, and most people are in line with it, then that means that we can understand what the bedrock philosophical ideas about sexuality are. So when we say that the medieval period begins in 476, what we also have to accept is that whilst the church is an incredibly potent force for shaping ideas about sexuality, they do not consider themselves to be coming up with these ideas out of whole cloth. And it is they who say that they are standing on the shoulders of giants and essentially saying that they are taking, in particular, Aristotelian ideas about philosophy and building on them. So they are doing the things that Plato, Seneca, and Aristotle, shown here, were starting, but they've got the veneer of Christianity on top of it, right? So almost everyone within the medieval church, especially when we're talking about the later medieval period, has been classically educated. So, if you're talking about 477, of course they have been, it just stopped being the classical period yesterday, they're not even aware it happened, so of course they're learning the same things that anyone was, a few years ago, right? By the time you have the rise of the universities and things like this in the 12th century, you have a particular way of thinking about the world that is codified into the trivium and quadrivium. So the trivium, grammar, logic, rhetoric, quadrivium, I always get this wrong. Arithmetic, geometry, music, and astronomy. There we go. I can do it. And all of this is predicated specifically on classical knowledge. So you're learning to write and read by reading Aristotle and indeed attempting to use these same forms of argumentation that he uses. So if we understand that the church considers itself to be an extension of these particular ideas, it's no surprise that you can actually just go look at ancient ideas of sexuality and they're pretty much the same. It's there isn't a whole lot of change around here except for the reasoning for why sex and sexuality is kind of bad. So a thing that I hasten to remind people of is that if you think it's weird, someone in the medieval period thinks about this, guess what? Greeks and Romans also thought that. It isn't medieval. You're being like, it's not like, this is just a thing. Okay. So, when I'm talking about conceptions of, sexual generation or ideas about, just sexual proclivities, a lot of those are very, very specifically classical in nature, but with a veneer of Christianity over the top to kind of explain it further. So, everybody likes to make fun of the medieval period. Don't. That's all. Unless you also want to make fun of the Greeks, in which case go for it. I don't care. That's fine. So yes, the church, as one of the overarching structures of the medieval period, we also have to be kind of careful with this, right? One of the reasons why the church manages to come to power is that they are incredibly prolific writers. They have quite a lot of buildings in which people who can read and write are doing that work and reading and writing. But in the earlier medieval period, they don't wield the kind of power that we traditionally associate with the church in the higher or later medieval period. They rather kind of spend a lot of time hanging out in churches or varying graveyards in Rome, writing down why they think they're important. And then after a few hundred years, people say, oh, wow, I found this document from 300 years ago that says the church is really important. Wow. And so it's an immensely successful propaganda campaign that they managed to do. But having said that, this is a Christian continent that we're talking about. They don't have a concept of Europe so much as they have a concept of Christendom. And granted, there are ways of not being in Western Christendom. So, for example, our good friends over in Constantinople have the patriarch system. They are doing whatever it is they're going to do. Down in Ethiopia, we now kind of refer to this as Coptic Christianity. So there are other ways of kind of doing Christianity, but there are the church fathers that we kind of find later that feed into all of this. And so we get to hear rather a lot from these guys, basically because of how power works and how money works and how just property works, right? So one of the places that we have the most extant sources from in the medieval period is the church, because they have all these huge stone buildings that are full of books. So they're overrepresented. Okay, we will say that. They're a little overrepresented. And so we have to kind of accept that what they're saying is what they want to teach, but then we have to kind of look for practice around that. So a few of the theologians that I'm going to kind of talk about today that really come up when we are discussing sexuality are your boys there, Augustine of Hippo and St. Jerome, who are two of the church fathers who had rather a lot to say about sexuality. I also like to include Hildegard of Bingen, who is one of the only women who really crops up to really speak about sexuality and has some really interesting ideas, which often run contrary to what all the dudes are saying. And then, of course, Thomas Aquinas, one of the most prolific minds of the medieval period, or indeed any period, I would argue. It's absolutely ridiculous how much this man was able to put out, but there it is. And all of them are kind of working within the same framework, although Hildegard gets to go a little bit off piece because she's a woman, right? So she hasn't been, receiving this same classical education of saying, you need to know about Aristotle, you need to know about Plato. So she's able to kind of veer off into her own direction. Whereas St. Augustine and St. Jerome, whose words are really, really taken as the foundational texts by the church in general, are still working within the antique connection. And then Thomas Aquinas is very much a peripatetic. He sees himself as a successor of Aristotle. And so he's intentionally courting these old classical ideas. Hildegard, as you can see, is just kind of wilding out, having visions, which is pretty cool. And I really respect that. But a lot of people liked what she said, so it counts and I can talk about it. But here's the problem with theologians, which is summarized by a bit of marginalia from an anonymous student in the University of Hull. If you're talking about Aquinas, if you're talking about Jerome, if you're talking about Hildegard, in theory, these are people who should not have been having sex, right? Or who ever had sex, And Thomas Aquinas, pretty famously, I think, really made it through without doing it. Hildegard, question mark. That's a lot of ladies. There's a lot of fairly romantic letters going back and forth. It is what it is. Of course, famously, St. Augustine had rather a lot of sex and then gave it all up and was here to tell you why all of this hot sex that he had when he was younger was bad, actually, now that he was over it. But, Christian moralists as a whole were here to kind of explain to you why it is that you weren't supposed to have sex, all the problems with sex, but there were people who were not engaging with it or oughtn't to have been. At the very, very least. So, we have to kind of work around that. So one of the things that we have to kind of understand about the church's relationship to sex is that it's very much related to the fall of man, which we can see here from this gorgeous British Library manuscript. And so the idea for all of these theologians is that sex is the original sin. So, now when people say, oh, they ate from the tree of knowledge and they realized they were naked, we kind of focus now on the knowledge bit of that. For medieval people, and indeed this is started off by St. Augustine, the thing is that Adam and Eve realized that they were naked and they find it sexy. And that's the problem. Right, so they then begin to feel lust. They also lose control over their bodies and they lose control of their genitals. Because before the fall of man, what would have happened is if Adam and Eve had wanted to procreate as God had told them to, the men would just kind of go, penis get hard now. The women would say, okay, vagina become lubricated and expand, and they would just, right up in there. The man would then say ejaculate. I suppose within the medieval sense, the woman would also say ejaculate, and then bada bing, bada boom, you got a baby, and then you're done. And it wouldn't be fun, It would be like shaking hands, and you would simply be done with it. And so one of the issues with sexuality more generally is that it's fun and sexy. And it's that pleasure that really creates part of the sinful nature of it. So, one of the real issues is talking about how much you are not supposed to be having sex and when it is that you can have sex and saying that, all right, well, here's sex. It's the sinful thing. It's this terrible thing that happened as a result of the fall of man. But we have to make babies, right? So in an ideal world, what you would do is you are going to have the least amount of fun possible whilst still making babies, right? So people are kind of really asked to keep pleasure to a minimum. So, for example, Thomas Aquinas will say, oh, don't make out too much, no lascivious kissing. You're not supposed to have any kind of rubbing of each other moving up to it. But then on the other hand, you have quotes such as this one, which we get from Hildegard. This is the first ever recorded description of the experience of orgasms for people with vaginas in the European canon. So she says, when a woman is making love with a man, a sense of heat in her brain, which brings with it sensual delight, communicates the taste of that delight during the act and summons forth the emissions of the man's seed. And when the seed has fallen into its place, that vehement heat descended from her brain draws the seed to itself and holds it. And soon the woman's sexual organs contract, and all the parts that are ready to open up close during the time of menstruation now close, in the same way as a strong man can hold something enclosed in his fist. And this gets at a couple of things, right? Because you're not supposed to be having too much fun during sex, but there is a certain amount of pleasure which is considered necessary, because obviously men need to ejaculate, but it's also considered that women have to ejaculate. And this is what we refer to as the two-seed theory. Funnily enough, Aristotle doesn't subscribe to this. Aristotle believes in the one-seed theory, where he thinks that women are just like a pot of dirt you put seeds in. But most people, Aristotle notwithstanding, think that's kind of stupid. So, the Galenic idea is that there's kind of like a two-seed theory. So the idea is, well, both people need to ejaculate. And so, you're going to have at least some pleasure. But that is part of the rub with sex as a sinful activity, because you're supposed to be having babies. That's the only time you're really supposed to be having it. But there's going to have to be some of that sexual pleasure that is so bad, and that's kind of part of the curse of the fall of man, right? So you have this really knife's edge kind of relationship to the pleasure that can be experienced during sex. And then there are these problems with sex in general, which is that sex as an activity is often kind of thought of almost as an object, I would argue. This is something very annoying and scholastic that I'm working on elsewhere. But there's this idea that sex itself has a number of properties which influence human beings. And this is shared very much in the classical period as well. So sex is considered to be enervating. It's intoxicating. It has heat. And as a result of all these things, it is feminizing. Okay, so I'll just unpack that. So the idea of sex with a woman is that women are quite interested in sex and are very sexually rapacious. First of all, because they're responsible for original sin. Secondly, because they're very stupid and they don't understand that sin is bad and that they should be interested in heaven and they shouldn't be attempting to have sex. Thirdly, because their humoral makeup is cold and wet. So if you understand the four humors, you've got hot, dry, cold, wet. Men are hot and dry, and women, because they are not men, are cold and wet. And so women are kind of like lizards, but for sex. So they are very interested in having sex because sex heats them up. So part of that is because of the fricative nature of sex. So kind of like rubbing wood together, people will often say it kind of warms women up. But it also warms them up because semen from men is seen to have the most masculine kind of essence that there is. So semen is seen as hot and dry, right? And so when women then have that inside them, then it warms them up. But the issue with that is that it therefore cools men down, right? So if you're ejaculating, then you have lost some of your heat and dryness, and you're becoming more cold and wet, which means you're becoming more like a woman, right? And so the problem with becoming more like a woman within this too is that then you're going to want more sex because now you're acting like a woman, right? There's the intoxicating effect of sex, where the more sex you have, the more sex you want to have when you're a man. And women never want to stop having sex, which, they could just kind of gesture broadly to that. So there's a Boccaccio quote about this, which is that whereas one rooster can easily satisfy 10 hens, 10 men would be scarcely enough to satisfy one woman, right? So there's this idea that women they are down for however much sex it's going to take. But as a result of that, they are then becoming more masculine. And so part of this is also kind of leads to a worry about people beginning to act out in ways that we would call homosexual. So this dates back to Romans, where Romans will say, for example, you ought not be having a bunch of sex because, it makes you really stupid. It makes you lose all of your manly qualities. When you lose your semen, you lose your ability to reason and to think. And what you ought to be doing is just having enough children as is necessary for, the republic or what have you, and then stop. And then otherwise, you're going to become like a woman, and who knows, you might start having sex with men. So it's a real fellas, is it gay to have sex with women kind of deal. And Romans and medieval people are like, yes, it is. It absolutely is. And so if you have a bunch of sex with women, you might end up having sex with men. And similarly, if women get too hot and dry as a result of having sex with a bunch of men, they might have sex with women. And then you're in a pickle because everyone is going to just spend all of their time trying to have sex, and society isn't going to run, right? So here is a picture from Hieronymus Bosch's Seven Deadly Sins, which shows lust. So, part of it is just like, oh, look, this man is at the feet of a woman. Oh, no. Oh, no. He's not being an upstanding man who's contributing to society. Oh, no, he's wooing a woman. There's two people in the back room groping, and then just some guys rolling around on the floor like idiots, because that's what happens when you have too much sex, right? So it's a slippery slope, people. Who knows, next you'll be eating cherries, and Bosch thinks this is real problematic. So what is the answer to this? The church says we need to systematize ways to think about sex, and I'm using James Brundage's really excellent flowchart, which no one will ever improve upon, which kind of creates a way of thinking about when it's okay to have sex. So it's like, well, A, are you married? It's okay to have sex. If you're married, that's the only way it's okay to have sex, right? You can't just go around having sex with other people. These things have to be limited. Okay. So if she's your wife, yes, you can. Have you been married more than 3 days? Now, the married more than 3 days question is kind of about letting the holiness really sink in from the ritual of the marriage ceremony, and so kind of like the consecration of it. Is your wife menstruating? Well, if she is, you cannot have sex because then you don't stand a chance of getting pregnant. I mean, you can get pregnant when you're menstruating, but it's very difficult. So no, can't do that. If she's pregnant, what are you talking about? The only reason it's acceptable to have sex is to get someone pregnant. So of course you can't have sex with your wife when she's pregnant. Stop it. If she's nursing a child, similarly, it's very difficult to conceive when you're nursing a child. So absolutely not. You cannot do that. Is it Lent? During the Lenten fast, obviously you should be thinking about God. You shouldn't be thinking about sex. So that's right off. Is it Advent? Advent is the time for contemplating the end of the world and apocalypticism. How dare you be horny? You're supposed to be thinking about the end of the world and waiting for the arrival of Christ. So absolutely not. Is it Whitsun week? The Holy Spirit just came here and you're going to be horny in front of him. You're going to be horny in front of the Holy Spirit on Whitsun week. No, absolutely not. Easter week. Oh, I see how it is. Couldn't wait for Lent to be over. Jesus just died for your sins. He's arisen and you're being horny. Is it a feast day? In front of St. Michael on Michaelmas. I can't believe that's terrible. Is it a fast day? Well, in a fast day, you're supposed to be fasting, thinking about God. Is it Sunday? Sunday is for church. So no sex on Sundays because that's for going to church. Is it Wednesday? Now, this is one confuses people because Wednesday is one of the traditional confession days. So if you're confessing, you want to be making more things up to be confessing about, so please stop that. Is it Friday? Similar. You should be confessing, stop that. Is it Saturday? Now, the problem with Saturday is that you might, because sex is so sexy and intoxicating and you want to have more sex, you'll be horny in church on Sunday, so Saturday's out. Right. Is it daylight? Well, that's very bad. You shouldn't be looking at each other and enjoying that. We said to keep it down, keep down the fun. Are you naked? No, don't get naked. Again, that sounds like you're having fun. You're not supposed to be having fun. You're supposed to be making children. Stop it. Are you in church? Okay. The thing about being in a church is that for medieval people, that's quite sexy because they don't have privacy such as we understand it to be in their homes. They're often in one big room, granted maybe with a tent around their bed or something. But, if you're really trying to get down and a church is empty during the day, you might attempt to have sex in it, but you ought not to do that. And of course, do you want a child? Now, if you're aiming for a child, fantastic, by all means. If all of these other things are true, then that's great. But otherwise, this is sinful. Right? So these are all the hoops that we need to kind of jump through in order for sex to happen. Now, the thing about that is that I didn't need to do that so quickly. The thing about that is that no one really listens to this, right? If people actually went along with any of this, you would have no children born in September during the medieval period because you weren't supposed to be having sex during Advent. And that's not true. There's rather a lot of Virgos running around the place. They still exist. Similarly, sex during Lent, well, that can vary. But, certainly there are children who are born in November and December, right? Jesus among them, right? So, these are things that people do not necessarily listen to. And, on top of that, what is really considered quite bad is anything that would kind of augment this particular sex, which is procreative, and therefore what we are asking you to do is put a penis into a vagina and ejaculate. That is the right kind of sex, right? So you're not supposed to be making out too much. You're definitely not supposed to be having any kinds of sex which don't lead to procreation, right? And so this is the question: what counts as sex, right? Here we have some images of sodomy. You're meant to understand is very bad. So on the left, we have a man going down on a woman. That's a bird's beak, kind of also the penetrating the man, which is it just kind of doesn't pair well. And then down below, we have two women and two men having sex. And I share all these images because what you see in both of these things is sodomy. And sodomy is defined as any form of sex that cannot lead to procreation. So it is as much sodomy if you perform oral sex on your wife as it is when two men or two women kiss. Now, this goes through phases where people will be cracking down a little bit more occasionally on same-sex contact. Oftentimes, this is very big, particularly in monastic settings. So, for example, we have a lot of... there are a lot of crackdowns. We'll have periodically abbesses go through and say nuns cannot sleep in each other's beds. If I hear you are not allowed to call another nun my little bird, and if I hear you calling her my little bird, you're both in trouble. Same thing with monks. And this can kind of ebb and flow. Sometimes in the earlier medieval period, there's a little bit more of a worry about this. Aquinas is quite obsessed with it, but Aquinas is obsessed with everyone. And by the time you get to kind of the early modern period, routinely in some of the Italian city-states, there will be dedicated police organizations who are just looking for gay men who are cruising, right? But all of these things we are meant to understand are bad because of the fact that none of this can be about procreation. And if the only acceptable way to excise lust is if you have children, then all of these things are equally bad. And this is an important point about medieval sex, which is that there's no real concept of one having a sexuality. So one person wouldn't say that, I'm heterosexual, I'm homosexual, I'm bisexual. None of that exists. What there is practice. And you either are a sodomite or you are not. So if you do sodomy, you're a sodomite. If you don't, you aren't. Congratulations. So we can certainly see ourselves reflected in the past, but they wouldn't label themselves in the same ways that we do. So all a part of this too, then is very interesting to talk about when we begin to consider women and sex, because as I say, women are kind of like these stupid horny lizards, or a stupid horny forest fire. That's a real popular way of talking about women. And Jerome writes about it, saying that women's love in general is accused of being ever insatiable. You put it out and it bursts into flames. Give it plenty, it is again in need. It enervates a man's mind and engrosses all the thought except for the passion which it feeds. So women in particular are kind of seen as being one of the largest issues when it comes to sex, because they're the ones driving this thing, right? Men, of course, simply wish to pray to God and not worry about any of these things, but women, because they are so incredibly sexually insatiable, will encourage men not only into sex, which is disordered, but into practice that is disordered. So there is a great deal of worrying, for example, about the fact that women are still interested in sex when they're menstruating. And this is conceived of as incredibly unnatural. So, it's part of the proof of the fall of man, because beasts of the field, cows don't try to have sex if they can't get pregnant. But women will, which is kind of proof of this break with God and this unnaturalness which surrounds it. But I bring this up because I think it's quite an important thing to have a look at, because this is very much the opposite of how we think about sexuality now, and the gender around it. But it's not just medieval people who think this. And sure, medieval people have this real Christian way of thinking about things. They think about, lust having come from the Garden of Eden. Of course, women are more lustful because they're responsible for original sin. But this is also the way that Aristotle writes about sex. This is the way that Plato writes about sex. This is the way that people within the West, or the global North, whatever it is you wish to say more generally, think about gendered sexuality. And this holds true up until about the Enlightenment, really. So I think it's very important to kind of think about who is seen as the driving force behind disordered sexuality there. So also I've got this kind of leads to how women often behave very badly. So within Burkhard of Worms' Penitential, for example, he talks about women who are making what we would call dildos and strap-ons. So he says that priests need to police women's sexuality, and when you are in confession, here's your penitential. It's a guide to what it is you need to do. And he says that you should ask women, have you done what certain women are accustomed to do? That is to make a sort of device or implement in the shape of the male member, of the size to match your desire. And you fastened it to the area of your genitals, or those of another with some form of fastenings. Have you fornicated with other women, or others have done it with a similar instrument or another sort with you? If you have done this, you shall do penance for 5 years on legitimate holy days. And now this is an important thing to kind of have a look at, because here we see what we would describe as gay behavior. It's two women having sex using a strap-on. They, however, see this as just kind of gals being pals, and something that women will do. And granted, it's bad and you must confess for it, but this is a 8th century text, and you're supposed to do penance for 5 years on legitimate holy days. So, it's not as though you're meant to be excommunicated from society. It's none of these things. It's it's a long penance, but it's not every day. You're supposed to be kind of doing things in and out. So there's this understanding that women are behaving badly. Women are doing gay things, right? That's what we would say. But it's not the end of the world. It's just, something that you give them a slap on the wrist and you get them to move on, right? So women are understood to be not always on their best behavior, but correctable earlier on in the medieval period. So to sum this up in the fastest way I possibly can, realizing that I've already gone over, which as is my wont. If you're trying to kind of think about sexuality and the way it is conceptualized in the medieval period, you have to understand that you're going to have a lot of your sources from a very hostile witness, which is the church, who thinks that you shouldn't have sex and that all sex is bad. But the medieval church still thinks about sex in the same way that classical people do. But then there's just kind of this extra veneer of the concept of sin on top, which they don't really have. However, no one really cares what the church thinks. People have sex in all sorts of ways. They don't really, you might go and get yelled at by your priest for having strap-on sex or something, but, you still did it. You still have, a nice time. And another thing is that what medieval people kind of think about sex and what they consider to be fun and sexy is sort of the opposite of what we think. So for them, they are spending all this time having these forms of sex that the church is like, please stop doing hand jobs. Please stop having oral sex. And please stop having interfemoral sex. They absolutely love interfemoral sex for whatever reason, Whereas we have really internalized the church's idea that the right kind of sex, the acceptable sex, is procreative or penetrative. But medieval sexual practice is often focused on these other things. And we know this from reading penitentials. We know this from the church being like, please stop, just stop doing that. I'm begging you to get pregnant, right? So we need to understand that these things are always in flux. There isn't really a right way to think about sex, right? There are all kinds of different ways to conceptualize it, to think about it, and to practice it. And medieval people's relationship to it is a great window onto our own practice and a way that we can think about our own society. So I think we're going to go with that for summing up.
Thank you so much, Eleanor.
No worries.
So let me check out Peter
Yeah.
review. So Eleanor, was fascinating, by the way.
Oh, thanks.
Do you know or have you come across of any specific expectations or taboos related to like male and female sexuality?
Yeah, I mean, about a million.
Yeah,
exactly. But it's quite interesting, right? Because here the most common sources come from the church, but we also have opposite kind of opposed ideas about sex sometimes, which particularly come from medical sources. So, for example, one of the kind of real tensions can surround women's sexuality, where there's this idea that wombs can suffocate. Okay, a womb can suffocate if women's sperm builds up to the point that it doesn't get released, and it can suffocate your womb, and that can kill you, make you hysterical, do all kinds of bad things to your womb. So there's this idea that women need to orgasm a certain amount in order to expel their semen, and if they don't, they will go crazy, right? And when medical professionals write about this, they say this is something that, you really do need to kind of accept as a possibility for medical care. So especially women who are widows who are used to sex might need to go to a physician or to sometimes a midwife. And they basically prescribe that you jack them off. They're kind of like, you sort of put warm poultices on the vulva and kind of give it a bit of a rub, or they'll say, take oil of spike dart and put it on your hands, get them real oily and just get in there, kind of thing. And they'll also say, oh yeah, and this explains why young girls are often jacking each other off. It's like, what? And physicians are like, you know how young girls are. Just leave them alone for a couple of minutes and they're just they're getting really handsy. And they take great pains to point out that when young girls are doing that, or when physicians are doing it, it's not really sinful because they're actually responding to a medical need. Right. And so clearly they're great hastening to say, it's not actually sinful. This is a medical problem. They realize that it's going to be perceived as being sinful. So there's that real kind of tension there about what is kind of acceptable, and the tension between the medical community and the religious community there, although there's a huge overlap in those two things. So I find that a quite interesting sort of thing specifically for women. For men, one of my favorite things is the ongoing hand-wringing and debate around what they call nocturnal emissions, what we call wet dreams. To the point where, very nice members of the clergy, who are doing everything right, and they're not masturbating, and they're not having sex with each other, and they're not having sex with anybody else, but they, from time to time, they will have a wet dream, and this freaks them out, because they're trying to do everything right, and they're worried that they're kind of sinning in their sleep. So this is debated quite often in theological circuits. So Thomas Aquinas says that it's not sinful. He says there isn't really anything that you can do about your brain when it's dreaming. So if you don't have control over your brain, which is the thing that is making you ejaculate, then it can't really be considered to be sinful. That's just kind of something that's there. But it shows you the real extremities to which people certainly do believe this, to the point where they are worried that their immortal soul is in danger, even if they haven't done anything, So we can kind of like laugh about it, right? But these are people who are really, they've internalized this, they believe it,
Like, I'm sinning, but how? Why?
Exactly. I didn't want to. I would have said no,
Yeah. And probably in a completely other hand, there is because we see a lot of series, movies, a lot of stuff, and sometimes, ridiculous stuff. But there is any myths or misconceptions about sex during that period?
Yeah, I think probably the biggest misconception about medieval sex is that people listen to the church. Right. Which I find very funny because, I don't know if you know any religious people now, but, I'm from the States, and boy, howdy, they sure don't. listen, it's all well and good on paper, but then you have practice, right? And so there is this kind of I think eagerness to take the church at its word, which I find to be a bit infantilizing of medieval people, because now no one would really think that every single Catholic is following every single thing the church says about sexuality to the letter. No one really believes that, but for some reason, if you are talking about someone in the 14th century, they'll be like, oh yeah, but they did. They absolutely did. And it's one thing to be talking about Aquinas wringing his hands about wet dreams, but this is this particular segment of the population who said that they weren't going to have sex, right? And then even within the clergy, we have numerous occasions on which we'll find that members of the clergy are having sex. So, for example, one of my favorite sources, which I'm always harping on about, which is the Archdiaconate Protocol from the late 14th century in Prague, has members of the Prague, members of Prague go around and say if they have any problems with their local clergy members. And these people in Prague are like, our priest is running a brothel out of his house. The priests have constructed wooden buildings in the churchyard and they rent them out so that you can go have sex in them. Our priest was caught having sex in a brothel and ran out naked down the street and everybody saw him, right? So even priests, are, and like granted, what happens in Prague stays in Prague or whatever, but it's not exactly an outlier. It's one of the most important cities in medieval Europe, and these kind of practices, if they're happening in Prague, they can kind of happen anywhere, And all you need to do is look at, Peter Abelard, who very much has rather a lot of sex with Eloise, and gets her pregnant when he is a member of the clergy and not supposed to be doing that. We see these come up over and over again. We see the love poetry between nuns, and we see, people get fined for having extramarital affairs or homosexual sex and all sorts of things like this. So it's very, very clear that these things happen, and the instances in which we're able to see it are few and far between, for the very important reason that when you're not supposed to be doing it, you're not writing down, hey, everybody, having a bunch of the kind of sex that I wasn't supposed to be having, this will surely be kept as a record for 800 years, right? Because it's very difficult to get these records to us over the years. And so what we can see is just the tip of the iceberg, right?
Definitely, yeah. I will pass now to Peter because he has some questions as well.
Brilliant. Eleanor, I must second what Joao said. Thank you so much for the talk. It was absolutely fascinating and, yeah, really engaging. I'd like to ask a bit about Hildegard, if that's okay.
Of course.
Yes. I was fascinated by what you said at the start about how she differs in some ways from male theologians in the way that she sort of thinks about sex and sort of writes about it. I was wondering, could you please expand a bit on that and kind of where she kind of deviates from her kind of male contemporaries?
Yeah, so one of the big things that she absolutely does is she's like, women are not evil, actually, and women's sexuality isn't evil. And so, and indeed, she kind of spins this around in a lot of cases. So there's a lot of worry, for example, in the medieval period about menstrual blood, and people say, oh, well, like women are poisonous because menstrual blood is sort of like the humors that they couldn't burn off because they're too cold and wet, and so it's expelled, and so it's poisonous, and if you touch it, then you're gonna die. Like that. I'm serious. You're gonna get leprosy and you're going to die. And so there is all this kind of hand wringing about women's sexuality being, like a forest fire, like being overwhelming, by being all consuming. And that's not what Hildegard says. Hildegard says in direct opposition to this. She's like, actually, semen is poisonous. And when women ejaculate, their body brings out a kind of antidote to it. And so it's actually this really mystical, wonderful, spiritual thing that women's bodies can absorb the poison of men and turn it into something, wonderful and beautiful like a child. And she says that women are not actually these rapacious sexual beings that men actually think they are. And instead, they do have a kind of all-encompassing, overwhelming sexuality, but it's very gentle. It's more like the waves of the ocean, she says, and it's kind of something that it can overcome you, but it isn't aggressive, is kind of what she says about these things. So she seeks very directly to counter ideas about women and sexuality, and says instead, these are kind of two parts of a necessary whole for procreation, and you don't really have to be going around demonizing anyone. You can just have the sex that is necessary for having children, and that's what God said had to happen. You don't have to be like, and women are bad the whole time. You can just kind of get on with it and make children without demonizing anyone. And I find that really interesting. All it takes is like one woman without a classical education.
Just someone to point out like a really obvious point, and there we are. And I'd be fascinated. Like, do we get sort of any evidence of any tension between, like, say, male theologians kind of receiving this stuff, or is she able to kind of write it and disseminate it? And
well, yeah, it's in this is in a causa et curae, I think. Causes and cures, so when she's writing about medical things, and there are some people who kind of like finger wag and they're like, oh, I don't know about all of this, but it's an absolute bestseller. People love this medical manual, and it gets all over Europe. People are using it everywhere. It's very, very popular within nunneries and monasteries. So it disseminates quite wildly, and people are very interested in what it is that she has to say. She's very much considered, a theological rock star in the same way that, any of the other big thinkers of the Middle Ages are. And so it's allowed to proliferate really interestingly, even under intense scrutiny. It's not as though the papacy doesn't send, people to check in on her and make sure that everything is above board. But these ideas are still allowed to circulate without any kind of form of redaction. We don't see much direct scholarly rebuttal. Everyone is kind of like, oh yeah, that's nice, Hildy. Okay. So I think that it's sort of like a drop in the ocean, unfortunately, compared to everything else that one sees. But having said this, it's still a kind of major contribution in that this is the sort of thing that a lot of nuns would be reading, right? So another group of scholastics who are then kind of like writing and thinking are introduced to, the possibility of dissent, I suppose, however gentle, the possibility that sexuality can be conceptualized of in a really different way. And that's very meaningful, I think.
Absolutely.
Eleanor, in terms of touching now more about homosexuality, so sodomy in this case.
Woo.
How was homosexuality recognized and understood in the Middle Ages? You spoke a little bit about that on your presentation, but in a broad spectrum, and mostly even when we speak about the laws, because I saw a study not a long time ago that there was different laws, for example, for the giver and for the receiver, for example. Yeah. So can you talk about that?
That's really common, and so we have to be very careful too when we see the word sodomy come up. Oftentimes there are certain words that you have to really kind of prick your ears up. So for example, like a raptus, which means rape, you have to be very careful about, because sometimes it means you got married without your dad's permission, and sometimes it means what we would consider rape. And sodomy is one of these, because sodomy, it's like, oh well, this person was doing a bad thing. Usually if you get in trouble for it, it means that you're having what we would call gay sex, right? But sometimes you'll be looking, for example, at it's always the Italians, isn't it? Bloody Italians. You'll be looking at some statutes from Florence, and they'll say, oh yes, well, this sodomite got convicted of sodomy and he has to pay 5 florins. And then sometimes you'll see, we found that this sodomite was doing sodomy and we killed him, and you're like, oh, what do you mean by that? But then you look into it, and the one guy was cruising and the other guy raped a child, right? And there isn't a way to distinguish between those two acts. There isn't a concept of pedophilia, but there is an understanding still on a cultural level that one is more acceptable than the other, even if you have legal structures against this. But one of the things that we do commonly see is that you get in more trouble if you are what they call the passive member between between men, right? So, if you're bottoming, that's where the trouble comes in. And this is really common. You get this all the time, of course, like amongst the Greeks and Romans as well, for whom, it's absolutely fine. Exactly. If you're the top, so this doesn't, it's kind of like, yeah, well, that's bad. That's bad, but it's much, much worse to be interested in it. And it's because you're behaving like a woman. Right? So it's because you are taking on the passive role in sexuality, you are desiring to be like a woman, and this is kind of inverting the natural order of things. And so you get in a lot less trouble, for example, if you're just doing hand jobs. That's, you know, pretty okay. And there is considered to be a hierarchy of sodomy, especially between men, where it's like, and then the worst thing that you can do is anal sex. Oral sex is pretty bad too. They don't really want you inserting anything anywhere. But you know, like you can kind of get away with a bit of frottage. Like that would be kind of a bit better. But having said that, all of it is kind of considered, you know, as Thomas Aquinas would say, to be illogical, right? So, you know, you're not running your sexuality in the ordered way that God intends, and so therefore it's literally subversive, right?
Yeah. Still, we can look at in levels, and one of the level, it's not so much probably about the sexual acts, but more the fact that you are considered a woman again. So more than probably the sexual act itself.
Yeah, exactly. It's like the trouble is the subversion. The trouble is you know, God gave you everything. He made you a man, and this is what you do with it. You behave like a terrible woman, you know. Kind of a situation. And interestingly, whereas women are not supposed to be having sex with each other, there's a lot less hand wringing about it.
Yeah.
It's like, you know, you're not supposed to be doing it, but for example, you won't see women killed for it. You will see them get in trouble, you know, separated if they're nuns, occasionally fined. But it's a much more, well, girls will be girls kind of, because, you know, since women are so rapaciously horny, of course they're going to try to have sex with each other, you know, and so there's this kind of invisibility that women who have sex with each other often experience, and we see that as well.
And there are any religious figures or saints who are associated with, like, or known for their views on homosexuality as well?
That's a great question. Not that I am aware of. You know, I suppose, well, there's Aquinas, right? You know, he's got views. He's got views, and he's a saint. You know, he's a saint because of his views, right? As well. So, you know, the first saint to have become a saint through posting, you know, but you know, he just wrote so much. They're like, yeah, sure. So yeah, absolutely, Aquinas has a lot to say about it. So I guess that's certainly true. Occasionally, you will see saints whose miracles kind of include, or, you know, people who they're attempting to say they beatify them, or their miracles will include kind of like getting people back on the straight and narrow. So, you know, like a mother realizes that her son is taken up with like a loose woman or another man, and then she prays to a saint, and then he sees the light and goes back home to mom and gets married to not a loose woman, or, you know, whatever. There is a kind of real worry about you know, if you kind of like take up with loose women, you might then also turn gay as well. So, you know, the saints who kind of crop up here and there do that are there, but for the most part, that kind of all gets subsumed under kind of sexual sins writ large, and for that you have who we call, you know, the prostitute saints. So Mary Magdalene, Afra of Augsburg, Catherine of Alexandria, you know, sorry, Mary of Egypt, not Catherine of Alexandria. Sorry, Catherine of Alexandria. Patron saint of scholars, two different people. But yeah, so you kind of, if what we're talking about is sexual excess, then you go to them because that's the most sexual excess that you can be. Right.
And there is a concept as well that obviously everyone puts the Middle Ages in the same bag everywhere in the world. It's like it's only Europe, that's it. But do you know, or from what you study, that there is, like, in some cultures and societies that they are more accepting or tolerant of homosexuality comparing to others?
Oh my God, yes. So, like, for example, in Polynesian cultures, it's just whoa, woo. Mostly, you know, they're like, we have pineapples and really cool canoes. Who's having sex? You know, that's you know, real different ways of thinking about gender. You know, real different ways of thinking about sex. Gosh, you know, the Chinese imperial court. Whoa, buddy, who? They're getting down. You know, and granted, that might not trickle down to, you know, every single peasant in the village, but yeah, inside the Forbidden City, it's going off. I can tell you that much. Oftentimes we will see written about, especially from a Muslim perspective, how cool lesbians are. They're like, oh yeah, this is the discerning woman, you know. The discerning woman likes women, and they love it. They're like, yeah, she knows what she's about. Like that's wait, yeah, we like get her. And they especially like, you know, what we would call dykes. They think dykes are great. They're like she's looking like she's like, oh yeah, she's kind of out like acting like a man. That's fantastic, you know. And certainly, you know, within the Americas there's an incredibly disparate sexual practice, really different ways of thinking about gender more largely. So yeah, we're talking about a European context. I mean, you could go so far as to say, I don't know, the European and African literal, you know, like within the Afro-Eurasian context, it certainly gets down into other places and kind of moves around. But, you know, what is happening in Kazakhstan is not what is happening in, you know, France. And, you know, very famously, Genghis Khan was bi, right?
Yeah.
So, you know, and these aren't kind of like ways of thinking about sex that either kind of get into Europe, and Europe doesn't really have a way of influencing other people too, because everyone thinks they're just kind of weird and have a strange religion where they eat God, you know. So it's, you know, it just doesn't have the same kind of effect, right?
True.
Fascinating stuff. Out of interest, do we have any sort of like poetry or literature that kind of deals with like sort of sex or intimate encounters? I know that was quite a common thing in some areas of the Islamic world, but does that kind of translate over to Europe as well?
Yes, although what they have to do is pretend that it isn't about that a lot of the time. So, you know, what you see oftentimes is that they call it love, you know. So, you know, one of my favorite sources of all time, The Art of Courtly Love by Andreas Capellanus, is essentially a pickup manual, right? Like it's like this is how you get with chicks. And very specifically, there's he gives you these kind of guides of way of talking to women. So, you know, if you're a middle class man, here's how you talk to a middle class woman, or a woman of the lower nobility, or a member of the upper nobility, and it tracks with all of them. And there's this big kind of way about saying, well, you know, but ladies, you know, we could just do hand stuff, we could just do oral, that'd be fine, unless you want to have penetration, in which case I'm up for that too, you know. And this kind of like way you give a pseudo intellectual argument to let women know that you're up for anything while they are married, right? Like we have to keep in mind that most courtly love things are aimed at women who are married, and the idea is like, well, you don't get married for love, do you? You get married because you have to. So, you know, you're going to want to shag some guy, and here's how you do it. The Roman de la Rose, one of, you know, a medieval bestseller, is a really accomplished piece of courtly love literature, but it is also, we believe, just a way of talking about oral sex on people with vaginas. And the rose that one is romancing. There you go. Right. So there are things like that. And you find a lot of body literature as well. I mean, there body literature is all around it. Like all you need is fabulous. All you need is a fable. Ruth Mazocharis found one of my favorite ever sources, which is like, it's a dirty joke about a fisherman thinks that his wife loves him more for sex than for his money, and you know the good thing that she should love him for is his money, not the sex. And she's like, "No, baby, it's all about the money." He's like, "I don't believe you." So he's out fishing, and a corpse of a priest floats by? Question mark. I don't know. So he's like, "I'm going to play a trick on my wife," and he cuts the corpse's penis off. He takes it home to his wife, and he says, "Oh, honey, there's been a terrible fishing accident, and I've lost my dick." And she's like, "Oh no, I hate you. Okay, that is it. I'm gonna get divorced. I can't believe you. This is disgusting." And then he's like, "Ha, psych, I stole a corpse's dick." And then she's like, "Oh, I love you, really. Okay, it's fantastic." And like, and you know, it's all fine, and it'll be okay. And this whole thing is like an amusing anecdote about how much women love sex, right? And it's not, these things are not really just the provinces of, you know, the lower orders. These are the sort of things that you would tell at court, and everyone would go, "Oh, what are women like?" You know, so they really have a very bawdy sense of humor, which kind of makes sense in a world with very limited privacy, right? So yeah.
That's fantastic. It reminds me of just how brilliant studying medieval source work can be.
It's so fun.
Absolutely. And picking up on that subject of privacy, I'm interested in sort of I appreciate we sort of discussed about the church and how, sometimes people just had to make do with where they were, which has got me interested. Like, what was kind of privacy like for kind of sex in the Middle Ages? Like, was it the same kind of way that we think about it today, or did they have to kind of, find ways around it, given that sort of privacy and kind of, private space was less of a thing?
Yeah, so it seems that they would prefer to have some privacy, but that it's in short supply. Again, there's a poem about the ale fair, and a young chambermaid is taken out by a young lad on a date to the ale fair, and then they end up having sex in a field. And this is kind of one of the best sources that you can have to kind of understand this, because what ends up happening is rather a lot of sex outside, rather a lot of sex in the field, because that no one's around, and that's kind of fine. Of course, if you're extraordinarily wealthy, you might have your own bedroom, in which case, like, that's fine, but you're extraordinarily wealthy if that's the case. So otherwise, it's just sort of these bed tents, right? So you have the tent drawn around you, and then, but noise is always going to be a factor there, right? And so as a result, we can really understand why we get so many body stories, why we get all of these like kind of ha-ha things, because sex is sort of happening very near people all the time. And again, there's this thing about, having sex in churches. And so there's these warnings, don't have sex in a church. And there will also be these stories about what happens if you have sex in a church. Well, there'll be stories of, couples. A couple had sex in a church, and so the saint that the church is consecrated curses them, and they get stuck together, and they have to go on pilgrimage stuck together to go beg the saint for forgiveness, and like everyone in the village walks behind them like banging drums while they're naked, and it's like, you had sex in the church, so there's all this this kind of reinforcement on a social level about like, don't go seek out these forms of privacy, but they are certainly there. And I mean, we can see this, for example, again in the relationship between Abelard and Eloise, where if you're incredibly rich, it seems like well, they were shagging all over the place, right? So her uncle's very wealthy, he's got some big Parisian townhouse, and apparently they're finding places to have sex where they're not being interrupted, right? So it's certainly possible. I just think that medieval people were better at being sneaky, is all.
That's fascinating. Thank you.
Just to finalize, because I don't want to take you here forever, otherwise we will be speaking here the whole night long. Do you think that in any way the attitudes towards sex in Middle Ages still influence modern perceptions and beliefs?
I mean, I would say so, in that I do think that whilst a lot of things have changed, right? Obviously, we don't think that women are the ones who are kind of driving sex anymore, but we still kind of make women responsible for sex a lot of the time, right? So whilst women are not meant to be interested in sex, there's a lot more stigma on women who have a lot of sex than there is on men who have a lot of sex, right? So we've kept that. We really like that one. So, it's kind of like linked up to the sort of right kind of women, wrong kind of women. So you're either an Eve, right, who's very interested in sex and easily tempted, or you're Virgin Mary, and you're everybody's mommy, and we still do that. I also think that, you know, as I say, we've really internalized the church's teachings on sex, and, you know, for us, real sex is procreative. And that's new, right? So it's funny because that's not what medieval people think, but it's what the medieval church thinks. So they won that round. Good for them. Took them hundreds of years, but they did it. You know, like the society's getting less and less Christian, but that's one that really sticks with us, which, you know, there are Enlightenment issues with that as well. You know, this desire to kind of turn sex into a medical something or a scientific something then forces a kind of medicalization and explanation of sexuality as purely procreative in order to justify itself, right? And I think as well in there, you know, we still kind of have this idea that if maybe we don't think that you should be married anymore, but we certainly do not like non-monogamous sex, for example. We would really, really prefer that you were having sex with someone who you're in a long-term relationship with, at the very least. And it's certainly changed in that, we think it's okay that you can have several long-term relationships and have sex with many people, but if it's under a year, we're not sure that we like that. So there are all these things that are still kind of in there and that are in our cultural psyche. But I think it's important to remember what it is that we have changed when we hold those up, because often people will say, oh, this is just the way things are, it's always been like this, it can never ever change. And it's like, well, we changed all of that, so I think we could.
Yeah. Thank you so much, Eleanor. And before I pass to Peter to thank for your kindness to be here with us tonight, I want to advise everyone that wants to know a little bit about the subject to buy this beautiful book, which is The Once and Future Sex, Going Medieval on Woman Role in Society. So it's available in Amazon everywhere, basically here in the UK at least. And also, please follow the Going Medieval. It's amazing. Eleanor is now part of it. And Eleanor Patreon, which is amazing as well, please. Thank you so much.
An absolute, if there's one thing I like doing, it's talking about sex. So a delight to be here,
And by the way, for Eleanor Books podcast and Patreon on our YouTube video, I will leave all of the links below as well. Okay.
Fantastic. Well, Eleanor, thank you so much. This has been absolutely incredible. We've really loved having you here tonight. So thank you so much for joining us. Thanks to everybody watching, and we hope to see you next time. Take care.
Thank you.